So I will be talking today about the work which we did with my colleagues in the CAC lab at ETH Zurich. First of all, what motivates us to do this work? There are two key points. The first part comes from the fact that, at least in our lab, we use a lot of models. I mean computational models from molecular dynamics or some DPD solvers, and etc. And they have a bunch of parameters which need to be calibrated. So we want to know what are those parameters and how much we can trust in the values of the parameters which we get. That's the first part. And the second part is that the models we use are usually computationally very intense. So we want to exploit somehow the HPC architecture to do the parameter calibration and also to run the models. So those are two parts. First of all, I will be talking about how we do it. So how do we calibrate the parameters? There is a technique which is called Bayesian uncertainty quantification, which assumes that we have a black box model which has some input parameters, some parameters which has input and output, and then we want to somehow get the values of the parameters. So what we do is we usually compare the output with the experimental data, which we can observe somehow. And then when we compare them, we know which parameters are better and which are worse and with which probability. So what we get in the end is the distribution over all the possible parameters of the model. So how exactly we compare the data to the output? There is a classical way. So the classical approach is to formulate a so-called prediction error equation, which will connect the data with the output of the model using some noise term. Usually it's an additive noise term with a Gaussian distribution, which is written on the slide. So after you formulated the equation, So after the equation is formulated, one can formulate a so-called likelihood function, which tells us how likely is the data given the current values of the parameters. How likely is to observe the data which we have. And then using Bayes' theorem, we can obtain the posterior distribution of the parameters, which is actually the thing which we're interested in. So that tells us how likely are the parameters given the data. And it uses a simple formula. So in this formula, there is that likelihood term and the prior term. So the prior is just includes the probability of the theta parameters, knowing nothing. So it's an a priori knowledge, some expert knowledge or something, or some physical limitations. That's what we can put in there. But in my work, we will particularly address the question, what happens if the likelihood cannot be formulated? So it happens, for example, in case of stochastic models. So we don't know what exactly the distribution. So by stochastic, I mean that if you fit it in with the same bunch of parameters, it gives you different results. And if we don't know what exactly is the probability of obtaining an outcome y given the parameters theta, then we cannot formulate the prediction error equation, and we go in a more generic framework of approximate Bayesian computation, about which is the next slide. So here we consider the case of the stochastic model. As I already said, that means that we get a probability distribution over the outcomes of the model given parameters, fixed parameters. So that's the first line of the slide. Then the trick here is to formulate the joint posterior, which you see on the second line. So this is the probability of jointly observing the specific parameters and the specific outcome of the model. So this again can be expanded by the Bayesian theorem. And here you can see, as before, the prior and the likelihood, and the probability of a model outcome. So the likelihood, we don't know how to formulate it in this context. So instead, we approximate it. And we approximate it in the way which is written further. So we choose some distance function. discrepancy function, which says if I observe a vector y and I have data d, so how close they are. It can be basically any function you like, but there is a limitation that it shows how close your outcome is to your data. So for example, if they are identical, we expect it to be 0. So the approximate likelihood says that that is the probability of getting an outcome which is delta close to our data with a chosen metric. So then, that was the approximate joint posterior, but it's basically just substituting in the general formula the likelihood with the approximate likelihood. So now let's see how to compute given this formula. So we cannot compute directly because there is a constant in the denominator, this P of D, the evidence, which involves a high-dimensional integration. So usually what people do, they use sampling methods. So we also use sampling methods, and let's just go slowly to the method we use by starting from simpler ones. So the most simple method which you can imagine is called rejection sampling. And how it goes, so it basically just tries all over the place. It selects some set of parameters theta from a prior, which the user fixes. And then for this theta, it runs the model and gets some outcome. So if this outcome is delta close to the data, then it gets then the parameter set theta gets accepted. Otherwise, it gets rejected, and so on, as long as you like. Here's just an example, very simple one, 1D model. I'm sorry, on the plot it should be theta and y. It's just a wrong notation. So here we will consider a model which just generates a random number, Gaussian or normally distributed, with a mean theta, where theta is a parameter, and the standard deviation 1. So our data is 1 point, it's just 0, and we will try to obtain the distribution of the parameters. So it's just a schematic. So let's see, we generate, the line just depicts our data, which is 0. So we generate the parameter theta. Well, here it's theta prime. It's, you can see it in the vertical dashed line. Then there is a distribution from which we will generate the model outcome, right? So we generated something, which is x prime. And this point, we'll now have to check if it's close, delta close to data or not. So delta in our case is 0.1. Well, it's greater than 1, so we reject the point. And we start again. We generate the point, theta. From this distribution, we generate x. And we check if it's close or not. So in this case, I assume it's close. So we accept the point, and so on. We run for as many iterations as you want. So in the end, you get a distribution which is hopefully normal. So that's how it goes. And of course, it has many problems. For example, if you have a very peaked posterior, then you will waste a lot of samples. Well, if you don't know where the peak is located, initially you would probably try all over the place, and you will waste a lot of samples. So it's inefficient. And a way to overcome it is to go slowly annealing, discovering the peaks and the regions of interest. And that's what the next algorithm is supposed to be doing. So we start with a prior, and then through some intermediate stages, we slowly anneal to the target posterior. The way it does it is by slowly decreasing the tolerance delta. So again, some graphics. We are in the parameter theta and in the parameter space theta and y. This is our data, again 0. So what do? Initially, we generate from the prior. These are some points which we get. And the first tolerance which we set is, say, like this. So it's depicted by the horizontal dashed lines. So we accept just the points which are within the tolerance, those two. And then we regenerate the population. And I will mention later how we do it. So we regenerate. We get a bunch of points. And again, we set some lower tolerance, which goes over there. So we will accept just the points which are within the band. OK, so now how do we generate the points. We do it with a Markov chain Monte Carlo method, which is a special variant of like a classical Markov chain Monte Carlo for the approximate Bayesian computation. So what we do is, as always in the Markov chain Monte Carlo, we'll be sort of jumping around and trying points. So we start, again, the dot is our data. This theta 0, x 0 is our initial point. And from this, we will start. So first try, we jump out of the region, how to say, out of the region which is obtained by the current tolerance level. So we reject the point, and we come back to the previous one. So from the previous one, we jump again and reject again. Then we jump and we are within the region, so we accept the point, and then from the accepted point, we keep jumping. So right, and then it builds up slowly a chain. So yeah. So here, there are two key moments. The first one is the proposal. So the proposal tells you how exactly you jump from the current point to search for the next one. And the acceptance says you with which probability you accept the new point. So you don't always reject, but yeah, sometimes you accept. Here it's just based on this jumping kernel and the prior distribution. Plus, we always reject the samples which go outside of the region of interest. So that's how we sample. And here's just an overview of the algorithm which we use. It's called ABC-SubSim. So it goes, as I mentioned already, it goes on annealing the distribution from prior to posterior in stages. So here you see that we start with a prior here. Then we have some stopping criterion. So delta is the tolerance you want to achieve. And if it's not achieved, then we update the delta. So the delta is updated such that we just accept 20% of samples. It's the recommended value in the original paper, but you can vary it. So from the selected samples, we rejuvenate the population. So we run Markov chain Monte Carlo, which you can see here. We get a new population. And again, we get some new tolerance delta defined by the 20% of the discrepancy array. So if it's smaller than we want, then we are fine and we stop. So that's how it slowly goes. Yeah, so that's the method which we will use. Now, how do we implement the method? So our implementation, well, first of all, yes. As I already mentioned, that our computational models are rather expensive. Plus, for this Bayesian inference, you need a lot of runs of them. So yeah, that's already some challenges. And we have various levels of parallelism. For example, on the algorithmic level, when you, by algorithmic, I mean that independent Markov chains can run in parallel. They don't interact. Plus, we have simulation level of parallelism. So for example, if your MD simulation can run on 8 cores or more cores or whatever number of cores, that's another level of parallelism, and we want to take them both into account. So we deal with this with a library which was written by Hadjidoukos and others, and the library is called TORC. So this exploits task-based parallelism, and it can run on various architectures from laptops to clusters. It provides automatic load balancing, like within the library, so the user doesn't care about that. Yeah, so basically it uses a pool of tasks and a scheduler, and the scheduler distributes the tasks dynamically to the workers which are currently done with the previous part of work. Yeah, so the code is easy to write, and the library can be integrated with external software, for example, LAMMPS for the molecular dynamics. So this is a typical task graph of the algorithm which we are dealing with. So that's, for example, the ABC-SubSim. So here we have stages from the zeros to the very end. So the zero stage is somewhat special because here we don't have Markov chains, it's just sampling from prior. So we have a bunch of samples, and for each of them we just run a model. But for all the others, like here, you can see that we have chains. So here you see the Markov chain, which is, so different chains are independent. But within each chain, you cannot, we don't parallelize because the task just goes sequentially. Then each function evaluation, so this is approximate likelihood evaluation, can consist of multiple model runs. For example, if you want to run for multiple temperatures in MD. So here you see this. And each model can be, again, parallel. So those are the levels of parallelism which we have. I mentioned that the code is easy to write. What I mean by this, so if you want to write some algorithm from scratch, then this is the kind of writing you will face. So on the left, you see the serial code. So we want to parallelize the execution of the loop. And on the right, you see the TORC code. For me, it's very similar to POSIX threads. So in here, you just launch a task. In the beginning, you initialize, and you wait here. And the task is basically the same. But this is if you want to write a new algorithm. But we have written on top of the TORC a library which deals with the UQ algorithms, like ABC-SubSim, for example. So it already, the algorithms are already implemented. It's an open source code, which you can find on our home webpage. And the algorithms which we currently support are the TMCMC, it's for exact Bayesian inference, the ABC-SubSim, which we implemented for this paper, for approximate inference. Then we have optimization algorithm, and rare event sampling, and finally the numerical differentiation. So for those algorithms, you will just need to connect it with your application, and that can be pretty easy. So now the application for which we use the algorithm. So the application will be from the molecular dynamics. So we consider the Lennard-Jones potential for helium. So probably many of you know this. You can see it here. So it's just the interaction between two atoms of helium. And here we have two parameters to calibrate, this epsilon and sigma. So the depth of the potential well and the range of interactions. And the data which we use, we intentionally took it non-Gaussian so that we can confidently use the ABC-SubSim. So it makes sense. So the data is the distribution of the Boltzmann factor over time. So here you see this. It has non-Gaussian fluctuations. So we will try to use our approximate, well, not our, but our implementation of the approximate method to solve this kind of problem, to infer the parameters epsilon and sigma. So the discrepancy functions which we used actually 3 different types. So the first one mimics the classical Bayesian inference, and it compares the mean and the variance. So if we assume that the distribution of our data is Gaussian, then it would make a perfect sense because mean and variance in that case is a sufficient statistics, and we cannot infer any more information using other discrepancies. So that's the first choice. The second choice is quantiles. So we just take quantiles of the distribution from the experimental one and the model outcome, and we compare them. We took 4 of the quantiles. And the last one is a Kullback-Leibler distance. So we just directly compare 2 distributions with this matrix. And we just applied all the 3 cases to our problem, and let's see what we observed. So as we expected, the left case is the Gaussian case. So here we get some unidentifiability in the epsilon space, so over here. It basically spans all over, so it's from, maybe it will be shown, yeah. So it's all over from 0 to almost 1. So it just spans all over the prior range. While, so that means that assuming Gaussianity is that case and using the classical inference would be somewhat misleading. Another cases with the quantiles and with the quantiles and with the Kullback-Leibler, they provide more narrow estimates. And also with this the data was generated by the same run. I mean, by a longer run, but from the same system. So here we plot like the reference point, at least the green star, and somewhere there, I don't see it from here. Yeah, so basically here we just show that assuming less about our distribution provides us with more accurate estimates over here. It's just the same as upstairs. And from the parallel performance point of view, we used the 512 nodes on PITSDAINT. So it's around 4,000 CPUs. We used 15,000 samples per stage, and it took around 0.4 hours of wall clock time per stage. Yeah, and here's the methods of parallelization. So we used the TORC workers, and for our LAMPS run, we used the MPI parallelization. So this is the distribution of the time and efficiency. This is for the Gaussian case, but for other cases, it's similar. So basically, this plot shows the same as the first row of the table. It shows how the evaluation times go with the stage. So initially, it has a pretty high variance on the first stage. You can see it also here. That's because in our case, the sigma in the Lennard-Jones, the sigma parameter in the Lennard-Jones potential contributes a lot into the function evaluation time. So, and at the first stage, it varies wildly. While in the last stages, it converges to more or less one estimate. That's why initially we have a high variance, and at the last stage is almost negligibly small. It also contributes to the parallel efficiency, because so here you can observe that for the second stage, well, the first stage, the zero stage, I don't mention because it's just a bunch of parallel runs. The first stage has the lowest efficiency. That's because runs with bigger sigma contribute, well, they take just longer time. And at that stage, per worker, we had around 3 chains. So it might happen that one long run can like overtake all the short runs. But then when the runs get more uniform, we reach higher efficiency, and at the last stage it reaches 87%. Yeah. So as a summary of the talk, we showed how to efficiently exploit the high-performance computing architectures for the Bayesian Bayesian inference in some large-scale models. We also, yeah, it's just a general comment that the models which we use might require some re-examination for parameter calibration, and that's what we do with the Bayesian inference. With this, I would like to conclude, and thank you for your attention.